I love the idea that nirvana is something that's in us already. It's just suppressed by our suffering and our identification with the ego. And so when we drop the ego, it naturally arises. So it's not something we have to go and cultivate. I got to feel nirvana. I got to go to a beach and bathe in the ocean and be in nature to get this nirvana. It's already there. It's just dropping the suffering, and it naturally arises. Hello, welcome to another episode of Soul Sessions with Creative Mind. I'm Deborah Burnt Maldonado, here with Dr. Rob Maldonado, and we're so excited to host part 2 of our series on the Buddha. We are doing a series this summer on the great minds of philosophy. Last episode, we talked about the Buddha, and of course, we have so much to cover, so we're going to continue this episode going a little deeper. But before we start, I would love for you to subscribe to our channel. If you're watching us on YouTube, just click the button here in the corner so you do not miss another episode and you can listen to part 1 of this series.
We'd like to dedicate this show to our students in the spiritual teacher training program who, they're just a joy to work with.
Yeah.
And, we love you guys.
Okay, so today we're talking about the Buddha. The last episode we talked about the Four Noble Truths.
Yeah, so we introduced this idea of Buddhism and Buddhist teachings as a philosophy. And again, we're approaching it more from looking at his teachings as philosophy and also with the point of view of psychology. What was he getting at? What gold is there in his teachings that we can use today? So there's a couple of aspects. Last time we talked about the Four Noble Truths. So number 1 is that life is suffering, right? Number 2 is that attachment and desire is the cause of our suffering, and that there is a way out of suffering. And then the 4th one is that the Dharma, the Buddhist teachings, are the way to transcend that suffering. So now we go into some of these aspects of, okay, then what are the subtle implications of Buddhist philosophy? 3 really important ones: that the world is impermanent. Life is impermanent in general.
That was it's so obvious, but it's not. And when you start just thinking about it, it really is mind-blowing. The second one is the concept of no self, which is also mind-blowing, especially if you grew up in a Christian, like you have a soul and there's this like unique part of you, and Buddhism is like, oh, that's not even there. It's very different. And then the last one?
The last one, kind of the implications of, if there is no self, what about karma? And then the final one is this idea of emptiness, which is central to Buddhist philosophy as well. So let's start with the impermanence of the world. Now, this is not metaphysics, because we can verify this. Try to find something that is permanent, that is stable, that is always there in the same way that it was even a few seconds ago. You will not find anything in the manifested universe that is always stable and constant.
The galaxies were constantly moving through. We're like on a rock hurling through space. Stars are being recreated and destroyed at every moment. And then even in those rock formations, if you go out to Utah and you see those, they're like, oh, they've been there for millions of years. Well, guess what? They didn't always look like that. Millions of years of the wind hitting the rocks created these amazing shapes. If you haven't been to Canyonlands in Utah, oh my God, it is incredible. Or Sedona. Just to look at these shapes that come out of the rock being smooth with all the wind. But it feels solid when you look at it, but it's actually impermanent, because a million years from now probably won't be there anymore.
That's right.
Or definitely not in the shape it has.
Right. And we know even very solid appearing objects, if we look at them through a microscope or through whatever instruments we have, the molecules are in constant change and movement. There's nothing that is permanent, still, constant.
And I think the good news of that is that if maybe nothing good lasts, but nothing bad lasts either. So wherever you're in life, that idea, it kind of frees you that you're not stuck anywhere. We're always in movement. So we can be, kind of repeating that that pattern, but to know that it's impermanent, that we can, there is an end to suffering. It's going to pass. This too shall pass. I've heard this many times before. You probably heard this too, is that the happiest day of your vacation is the day before you go, because as soon as you get on your vacation, the time is ticking away and you're thinking about going back to work, and now it's one more day left, and you're not really enjoying the moment because it's always, you're really attached in that impermanence of time. You're always moving through time. And so very, very interesting to contemplate when it comes to even striving for good things, because they can't last. They can't last.
Yeah, so Buddha is inviting us or teaching us to accept this fact, not to ignore it, and also not to despair about it, simply because it's a function and principle of the universe. It is simply the way we exist. Our bodies are impermanent. Every material aspect of the universe is impermanent. Therefore, if we fool ourselves, if we act as if things are permanent, we're setting ourselves up for suffering. It's one of the principles of suffering, essentially, that we're misperceiving our reality and acting in the wrong way.
And it feels a little insecure, like there's a groundlessness about life. There's just nowhere to stop. But also that's the reason why we suffer, because we're looking for that place where we're finally going to be happy. We're finally going to have the things we want, when everything's all going to line up, and it just isn't there. And so we have a false sense of security when we think things are set and that we can relax, and then life happens.
Yeah, and I think something wonderful happens when we accept this fact, is that we relax. We understand that this is the way life is, and just can we embrace it in its impermanent nature. And of course we can. We see human beings have done it all along, and simply enjoy the ride and enjoy the experience, and really not only out of like pleasure, like if tomorrow we die, let's just eat, drink, and be merry, but in the sense of, can we do this life with compassion, with really thinking about others and helping others ease their suffering. So it's not just a philosophy of nihilism of, what's the point if nothing's going to last.
Yes.
Buddha includes these ideas of cultivating the best in our nature. And so it's a very rich and complete philosophy in that sense.
It makes you feel uncomfortable, but then it actually shows that before, what you believed was a false sense of security. So you're now questioning, and it opens up to ask other things about life, which is number 2. If nothing's permanent, that means we're not permanent.
Yeah, there is no self, and this is another principle of the Dharma, that there is no self. And this includes our idea of an individual soul. In Buddhism, in the traditional or the Indian philosophy of Buddhism, he preached that there is no self. There is no core to us. Instead, he says that we are formed out of these aggregates. And
this is one of my favorite parts of the teaching.
Yeah, so that we're made up of these interconnections with the universe, with the world. He says there are several: form, feeling, perception, mental formation, and consciousness, or our awareness. He says you put these together, and we receive, or out of these forms, this sense of self. The sense of self emerges from these aggregates, this conjunction of these elements.
So it's like different from the self in Vedanta, where it's the collective of everything. The self, this is more the ego, like the individual conscious self, that there's a you that is there. And it appears to be a you. But if I remember in one of our lectures that we went to at the Buddhist Center, she was like, if you had your arm cut off, is your arm part of you? Is that you? Are you not you anymore without your arm? Are you, if you cut your hair? If you change your clothes, like it's all this, these separate parts of our body. Even when we think about people with dementia, right? They don't have their memories. So where is that person? Like, is that the same person? That movie called Still Alice, it came out like about 10 years ago. I'm aging myself, but it was really interesting to ask, if you don't remember who you are, who are you? And so where our memories, where our identity of what our degrees we received, awards we've won, we kind of think that there's this like ego I, and we cling to it. And if you try to figure out where that I is, it's not in the brain. It's not even in the body, because our body regenerates itself every 7 years. So everything is like impermanent, like we said before.
Yeah. There is, let's say, scientific information or data that kind of points to this fact. If we think about how our body is created, first of all, we have these genes that half come from our mother and half from our father. So already there's an aggregate of two things that coming together now form this new body. So this idea of aggregates, certainly, I think he was on the right track.
Well, even about epigenetics, because there's things that we inherit in our genetics from our past ancestors that we take on as culturally, fears, personality traits. So are we our personality? Like if you think about even when you're a child, the 12-year-old in you, the 5-year-old in you, the 25-year-old, the 45, are they different people, or are they in individual, like arising separately? And does that part of you all contain you, or are you now and that's not you anymore? So it really is so it's kind of a challenge to the mind, because we just assume that as long as we have a body, this is me, and I'm the sum of my past experiences, and I'm identified with all those things. And Buddha is saying, no, there is no you, which is so hard concept, because we want to be someone. Our ego wants to be someone.
Yeah, so absolutely. The illusion is seamless. Our mind creates this sense of I, this ego sense that is very powerful, and it functions very well in the world. It helps us survive, helps us fit into society. Yet it's hard to find, because it doesn't really exist. It's an aggregate, or it's an emergent property of these aggregates.
What about like in Jungian psychology, we talk about projection. So even other people's ideas of you, or your parents' idea of you, you kind of, a lot of people identify with people like me, or I'm a friendly person, or I'm likable, or I'm kind. Those are also aggregates as well, because it's all in context of behavior and experience, and then perceptions of others, and your self-perception. And then how do you really define who you really are in the world if you're always looking for other people to help you define yourself?
Right. That would kind of lend credence to this philosophy that these aggregates, genetics, epigenetics, conditioning, learning, cultural inculcation of what is proper behavior and what is not. All these things come together to give us a sense of ourselves. But which one are we? Are we the genetics? Are we the cultural being? Are we our learning, our narrative about ourselves? All these things together kind of contribute to that sense of self. But if you tease them apart, you see that there is no true self.
And in meditation, I think that the goal is to drop that ego, to drop that sense of self. And then if there's no preconditioned expectation of your life and who you are, then that opens up, you can be anything at any time, and not attached to what other people think or how you see yourself. And there's a freedom there. When we identify with our personality, our accomplishments, our failures, or successes, we're trapped. We feel this kind of trapped stress of trying to be somebody. That's what the ego wants, to be somebody. And feelings too, I think. That's another.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because feelings, we know, are an important element in conditioning. The way we feel about circumstances, relationship situations, they imprint strongly on the mind, and give us a sense of ourselves and what we can expect from the world.
And also feelings are impermanent as well. And you see a lot of people, myself included in the past, label people as an angry person. Oh, she's a sad person. She's an aggressive person. He's, a pompous, arrogant person. Like we label people, and then also the feelings or expressions they have, what they pull from us, we label. And then ourselves, like, oh, I'm tired of I am depressed. Like we identify with the feelings we're having.
Yeah, so we can see why the West would see this philosophy as nihilistic. That what's the point, right? If there is no self, if we are simply in this impermanent universe suffering, what's the point, right? But again, there's a liberation that comes when we accept this and we practice these practices of meditation and compassion, that it liberates the individual from the false sense of identity. That it gives you your freedom to really then experience the true reality, right? And that true reality we're going to get to when we get
What
to...
What is the true reality, Rob?
Well, let's go through karma first.
Ooh.
Because if there is no self, then what is this idea of karma, right? Karma is supposedly to be the good or bad karma, right? As people think about it.
Like you did something bad, so something bad's going to happen to you. Like there's an ego or persona acting that gets a reaction.
That's right. So it goes back to this idea that karma only applies if you're caught up in the delusion of being a self. In other words, in ego, in persona, in thinking of yourself as the body. If you think of yourself as the body, then certainly karma is going to apply to you.
And karma is cause and effect. It's not some deity in the world saying, dictating, what is happening. It's basically what you put out, you get back. So if you work really hard and you get success, that's karma. If you're lazy and you don't move and don't do anything, your karma is going to give you a certain result. It's that cause and effect. But we want to take it without judgment. There's no good or bad. It's just a cause and an effect. And so what happens with us is that we think about, well, when bad things happen to us, that we must have done something bad to deserve it.
Yeah.
And when we're acting, in order for us to judge something as good or bad, we have to have an ego, because it's always connected to us, So it's like your failure, your success, your achievement, your setback, that it's always identified with the self. So as long as we're identified with this ego, we have karma and we feel the effects of it. But if we're seeing ourselves beyond the ego, we're free of that. We can act out of choice. We can act out of free will. Also, karma, we teach in our coach training, we teach this is about conditioning. If we don't identify the ego's conditioning of cause and effect from early in life and all through life, we're constantly being conditioned. We end up not having control over our destiny because we're just living out the reactions that we set up in the past.
Yeah, that repetitive history. And we see it over and over. People simply replay their old patterns over and over again because it's a law of the universe. If you believe yourself to be this I, this individual ego, it has to go by its past experience, which is the karma, the karmic imprints playing out over and over again. So the way to freedom from this karmic wheel, of course, is through meditation, through practice of the Dharma, and the development of compassion and the higher elements of the mind, to reach this nirvana, right? And in nirvana, you experience this emptiness. So again, you can see
not
why
very popular.
why people accuse Buddhist philosophy of being nihilistic, but emptiness is not empty in the way we think of emptiness as nothingness. Here, emptiness is more the sense of pure awareness. So pure awareness, it's empty because it has no objects, and it itself is not an object. It is like a pure perception,
like an experiencer, kind of?
Yeah,
great.
that's right. That would be a good way to put it. That there are objects of experience, but the experiencer, or the what allows that object to be experienced, is empty of those objects. In other words, if you remove the objects, the experiencer is still there. This in Vedanta or in the Upanishads, we can say that is defined as the true self. But Buddha decided that because that would contradict the sense of no self, he called it emptiness.
I think a really good practical example of this is two people having the same experience of something unpleasant. Let's just say they had a setback with money and they were kind of concerned. A bill came in that they didn't expect. And so one person, if their karma is always worrying about money and always feeling in lack, that person's going to have a different experience. They're going to be attached. They're going to give all that power to the money, to the bill, to the external, and suffer. And say, ooh, I'm bad. I might have bad credit, or all the things that we identify with money and our identity. The other person can have the same exact experience, but with a non-attachment, and using that experience to be non-attached and notice that they used to be like person number one, but they're kind of working beyond that. And so the idea of emptiness means that the event itself is empty of meaning. It's the person who experiences it, or the ego tied up in it, will experience that same event based on their karma, based on what they have been conditioned to see the event at. But the event itself, we can say, oh yeah, that's a terrible thing. But you know what? We don't know. We don't know if that setback motivates that person to go off and be wildly successful, or that setback makes a person go deeper into despair. They get that choice. And it all is about how the mind approaches the event. And that's really the emptiness. The mind fills in, like you say, the aggregates. It fills in all the narrative of what that means from the past and places it on that experience. But the experience itself is empty.
Yeah. Yeah, in the Upanishads, Brahman, the universal consciousness, is often described as nirguna. Naguna means qualities, so nirguna simply means no qualities. In other words, it's empty of qualities. This is that emptiness that the Buddha is talking about. He experienced it directly in nirvana in his deep meditation, and he decided to teach it this way, that what is at the core of our being is this emptiness, this pure awareness that has no objects. It has no qualities to it. If it had a quality, just like in Taoism, right? The Tao that can be named is not the Tao. That's the same principle here. Anything that we name as consciousness is not consciousness, because consciousness is what is allowing us to think and ask the question and perceive and experience. But it itself has no qualities.
Also, if you think about just the name and form, you go into a restaurant and you see a server and you label that person a server. You don't see anything else but that person being a servant to you, getting your food and taking your order. You don't know what's going on in that person's life. You don't know what that other dreams this person has. And so we collapse people and things into this limited snapshot with these labels. And that is a very limited way to look. And I always think about people, like we were at a restaurant the other night and we talked to the waiter and he just telling us his story. And it was like, wow, this is so interesting to know this person, besides being a waiter, is as this person and what they're experiencing and what their life is like. And that's like, we want to kind of dig deeper a little bit and not collapse everything into a judgment. And the ego loves to do that because it needs to survive. So it needs to take what we learned in the past, and it's a security mechanism. Okay, I know how to deal with this. I know what to expect. And but then it limits us, because when things happen, events happen, when we meet different people looking differently or wearing uniforms or doing certain jobs, we have this assumption of who they are, and then we collapse them. Or even having an emotional outburst, or someone who's fighting with the clerk, the airline, or you just kind of collapse that person into that identity, and we're not freeing ourselves, and we're not freeing that person from that framework. So this impermanence, this no self, is a more fluid way to be in the world and less suffering if we can just, and I think it takes practice because our ego is conditioned to act this way. So we need a way to practice. And so the best practice would be meditation, would be a good way to start, and that self-inquiry, just like meditating on this idea that this doesn't have any meaning except the meaning I give it.
Yeah, that would be it. It's because this philosophy, let's say technically, it arose from the Upanishads, just like yoga and Vedanta. But it is essentially the same message couched in a different kind of cognitive structure. And Buddha was very much into systematizing our cognition and our experience, our human experience, so that we could reach this nirvana. How do we free ourselves from the misperception of the world as permanent and ourselves as a self, as a false self? Through understanding these principles, that the world is impermanent. In other words, what we're seeing is an appearance, very similar to the concept of Maya, that it is illusory in the sense that the meaning we see in the world is our meaning. We're the ones that project meaning onto it. It itself has no inherent meaning. And it itself, he goes even further. He says the objects, the world that we experience does not have an independent existence from our mind. In other words, we are creating it as we experience it.
So what we're experiencing is our mind, basically.
Yes. So further than that, then he says this no self, that experiencer of the world, it appears that there are two things, right? That there is the world and that there is this self, this I. He says even that is an illusion because the I is also an object in the world.
I know. I remember one of our spiritual retreats we were doing in Greece. It was like before COVID. And you had said you're an object in the Maya, this kind of illusory world. And I was like, oh, that is really mind-blowing to think.
Yes.
That you're watching yourself as an object. Instead of you and there's objects in the world, you are also a part of the objects. Another player on the team.
Yes. So the realization of this emptiness is nirvana, meaning it is total freedom from this karmic wheel of suffering.
And actually, I love the idea that nirvana is something that's in us already. It's just suppressed by our suffering and our identification with the ego. And so when we drop the ego, it naturally arises. So it's not something we have to go and cultivate. I got to feel nirvana. I got to go to a beach and bathe in the ocean and be in nature to get this nirvana. It's already there. It's just dropping the suffering, and it naturally arises.
Yes. It's more of a letting go of this false identification with the I.
And it's actually so hard to keep hanging on to this I. It's a tough, and when we let it go, it's so freeing. And we wonder why we hung on to it for so long. And it is a process. It's not something you can do in a retreat in a weekend to just let go of your I. You go back to the world, and guess what? Everyone's operating with their little eyes all around, and you're back into the world again. And so it's that practice, and it's a lifelong practice of mastering this idea. But yeah, these are just, the concepts are so simple, but they're so life-changing, and they don't have to be so, you don't have to go to a cave in the middle of nowhere to experience this or have the metaphysical experience. You can just practice in your everyday life. How do I let go of my attachment? What meaning am I putting onto this? Who am I? That's one of the big meditations they sit with, is who am I? And am I my arm? Am I my hair? Am I my clothing? Am I my digestion? Am I my illness? Am I my health? Am I my perfect body? Am I my chubby body? We all this stuff we identify with that makes us unhappy. And if we just sit with it and practice this, the wisdom is in us already to understand. So
Absolutely.
So wrapping up, life is impermanent. There is no self. And the way out of karma is to drop the ego. And after that, you achieve that nirvana or emptiness. So thank you, Rob, for fantastic talk on the Buddhists. And we will be continuing our series. Before we go, I do want to remind you to subscribe to our channel if you're watching us on YouTube to make sure you get notified of every episode. We're going to continue our series on the great minds of philosophy. We'll have another episode for you next week.